Okay, thank you. So we will start this program. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good day, everyone. Today we will have some discussions in 3-in-1 program. Here we have Professor Melissa. I introduce you once again, Professor Melissa Koch is Professor and Associate Dean Research at the Faculty of Law and Justice, the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. She runs the Southeast Asia Law and Policy Forum. Her research contributes to the field of comparative constitutional law, law and society, and law and religion, and also she is chief investigator on an Australian Research Council discovery grant on constitutional change in authoritarian regime. So students, before we start to hear Professor Melissa Koch deliver her material, please, you can ask the questions during Professor Melissa Koch delivering the material. You can ask the question to chat box, or you can raise your hand after Prof. Melissa Koch speech. Okay, I think that's all, Prof. Melissa. Maybe it's your time, about 45 minutes to deliver your material today, and time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to join you all again today. I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that. So today what I'd like to do is talk about the case of Myanmar as an example and a way of thinking through some of the human rights issues in the region. And I'm thinking about this more in terms of how law is used as a way to deny and exclude certain groups. And in this context, I'm talking about the Rohingya of Myanmar. So this is, for today, I want to focus first of all just on a book by Stanley Cohen that looks at this idea of denial and what we do with the knowledge that we have about atrocities and suffering. And this has similar resonances with the work of the scholar Robert Cover, who wrote about the idea of violence and its relationship to law, and really tried to explore this question of, well, what is the relationship between law and violence? So for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm effectively looking at the Rohingya as a case study and trying to think about, well, what explains the response of the state in particular to the Rohingya crisis, and why is it that that this denial is taking place, and in particular, what forms does that denial take place? So I think many of you would be aware that the Rohingya are a minority group in Myanmar, and that over the past decade since the transition in Myanmar, there has been a significant deterioration in their situation, leading to large-scale exodus and displacement from the country, and in many respects a corresponding denial by the state about the position of the Rohingya in Myanmar, a denial about their belonging and relationship to the country. And so in this context, what I'm interested in is, well, how do governments use law as a way to deny suffering? I think this brings us back to broader issues of human rights. Now, of course, one of the common ways that people have looked at the position of the Rohingya in particular has been through the lens of citizenship, and I'll come to that a little bit later on. And certainly the issue that they have in the absence of citizenship for many of them, or the denial of citizenship, is one aspect. But I'm going beyond this today to try and look more broadly both historically, but also beyond the idea of citizenship, to think about how knowing about atrocities and suffering gives us an illustration of the ways that the state is using forms of denial and using law in particular to affect that. So let me just begin with a story. Some of you may recall back in 2017, there was horrific violence in northern Rakhine State, which is where many Rohingya live or used to live. And that led to and was the catalyst for this exodus of Rohingya from northern Rakhine State to over the border with Bangladesh, which is where many of them still are today. And at the time, of course, Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner and the leader of the National League for Democracy, was the state councillor at the time. She wasn't actually the president of the country, but she was effectively the de facto leader of the government that had been elected in 2015. And so she had the responsibility of speaking to the UN, to the United Nations, the international community, very shortly after this crisis. And the day before she was due to speak, there were these protests, as you can see in the photo here, across Myanmar, of people who were effectively gathering under the slogan, "We stand with Daw Suu." And they were showing their support for Aung San Suu Kyi and for her position at that time on the Rohingya, which was effectively to question why they were leaving, to perhaps cast doubt on the scale of the violence and the response of the military, and to question why this had happened in the first place, rather than to acknowledge that significant suffering was taking place and acknowledge that large-scale displacement was happening because of actions of the military in particular. So these demonstrations, to some extent, were one representation of and manifestation of quite a widely shared view in Myanmar towards the Rohingya, which is that they don't belong, the perception that many people in Myanmar would not even use the term Rohingya, they might refer to them as Bengali. And so these protests were one manifestation of that denial, effectively, of even who they are and where they belong. And this also, even appeared, so the last time I travelled to Myanmar just prior to COVID, I happened to be in Mandalay and at the university there. And you can see on the mantelpiece there of an official within the university is a picture of Aung San Suu Kyi. And again, it has this slogan, "We stand with the State Councillor of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi." Again, a sign that people had these placards and were showing their support for her. So let me come to this specific idea of denial. So Stanley Cohen talked about three particular ways of thinking about denial. One is literal, and this idea of literal denial is denial that is blanket denial, that is sort of overt. It is overt rejection of any acknowledgement of suffering that has taken place. And so it's fairly straightforward in that sense. Interpretive denial is slightly different. It is where there might be acknowledgement of a particular situation, but a different interpretation is cast on it. And I'll come in a moment to a few different examples that give illustrations of this. And then the third is implicatory denial, which is more about not so much denying the fact that something has occurred or even how it occurred, but denying that action needed to be taken as a result of it, or denying responsibility in relation to it. So what I'm going to do is go through these ideas and effectively connect them to the broader question of, well, how have acts of denial operated to exclude the Rohingya from the political community in Myanmar? And what role do we see law and legal institutions playing? So I'm going to do this in three ways, effectively three case studies. One is through the creation of Rakhine State. So this is the idea that actually Rakhine State was only formed and recognised constitutionally in 1974, and so in fact is actually relatively new. I think sometimes in relation to the Rohingya crisis, we assume that Rakhine State sort of always existed, but what I will show is that there has been significant contestation over whether and how to recognise this region, and in particular whether to recognise minority groups that live within that area, namely the Rohingya. The second case study is around legislative reform as interpretive denial, and here I'll focus on the issue of the denial of the right to vote. So in the 2015 elections, the Rohingya effectively had their right to vote removed. And then the third is around judicial reform or in cases as interpretive denial. And here I'll focus on an example of a particular case where courts are involved in this process of denial. So here is a map in case you haven't seen this before. You can see in red is Rakhine State, the yellow to the left is Cox's Bazar, and that's the border over which many hundreds of thousands of Rohingya crossed in 2016, again in 2017. Okay, so let's come to the first example, which is this idea of literal denial. So first of all, there were claims made by the government in Myanmar and by the military that foreign or international media had exaggerated how many people had fled across the border to Bangladesh. So here I have a quote from the Commander-in-Chief himself, who suggested effectively that it was an exaggeration to say that large numbers of what he refers to as Bengalis were fleeing across the border to Bangladesh. And he goes on to suggest that actually, that this is effectively sort of false or fake news, and that perhaps somehow the international community is hiding the truth. So here, this is a fairly blanket claim. It's fairly blatant, and it's not particularly sophisticated. But this is how literal denial works. So effectively is very much denying it at face value that that the suffering had occurred. Another example of literal denial, again, this idea that international news may be propagating false ideas, is that ARSA, so ARSA, which was the Arakan Rohingya Solidarity Association, or a group that was deemed by the government to be terrorists because they were seen to be affiliated with the Rohingya movement, where there had been violent attacks on police stations in 2016, 2017. So the government referred to them as terrorists, allegedly, and then it was the military suggesting that, well, maybe the international community didn't understand the situation, didn't realise that that they were terrorists. So literal denial is fairly straightforward, and let's come now to the more complex one. This is interpretive denial, and a lot of the discussion here was really around why did the Rohingya flee to Bangladesh, and the suggestion both by the military, namely the Commander-in-Chief, but also by the government, including Aung San Suu Kyi herself, was really to question why the Rohingya had fled, or to question the validity of them fleeing, and to instead perhaps suggest, as the military did, that maybe they fled either because of some sort of similarities of language, of racial or cultural solidarity. So this is a fairly overt claim and an attempt to create a counter narrative, if you like. Aung San Suu Kyi was a little bit more open in some respects, or at least cautious in questioning simply why they had chosen to leave and why some had chosen to stay, which perhaps implied that those who had left didn't have a good reason to do so. And the military, of course, was being much more overt in effectively suggesting that maybe they had returned to where they had come from, and using the inflammatory language of Bengalis. Another example of interpretive denial, which is perhaps easier to focus on, is whether or who in particular burnt down villages and houses. So there were many different international groups and NGOs that have documented various aspects of this crisis. One of them was Human Rights Watch. And you can see here on the screen a picture of a village that still exists but was burnt down during this conflict. And so the act of interpretive denial here was about, well, who burnt down these houses? And it was the military again claiming that perhaps the Rohingya had deliberately burnt down their own houses. And this was particularly perhaps difficult to accept in many circumstances, because there had been, for example, a party of media, foreign media, that had been allowed to go into Rakhine State, and while they were there, they saw other people burning down these houses well after the Rohingya had fled. So these claims don't necessarily have to make sense, but nevertheless they are counterclaims. Interpretive denial, another example is around landmines. This is just a picture in Myanmar of where in 2016 there were casualties reported as a result of landmine injuries. And while you can see most of it is actually to the right of the map, there is a smaller part of Rakhine State you can see there, which is coloured in. And so when these hundreds of thousands of Rohingya fled to Bangladesh, tragically some had injuries that were consistent with landmines. And so this raised the question of, well, who laid the landmines? And again, it was the military and government suggesting that maybe it was the Rohingya themselves who had laid the landmines. Just a final, turning now to implicatory denial. So we've talked a bit about interpretive denial in a general sense, and this is an example of implicatory denial. So this is where the actual facts of the situation may actually be accepted or uncontested, but what then to do in response to that is where the difference lies. So the numbers I have up here, I mean, this was only in August 2017, and so it has obviously changed since then. Sorry, that's the population prior to the conflict in 2017. The second number down the bottom, the 400,000, is the new arrivals that had taken place. And when this occurred, effectively, you had hundreds of thousands of Rohingya in Bangladesh, and the government and military not responsive in terms of a willingness to acknowledge their role in responding to this and the crucial need for humanitarian access and aid. So that is, it became clear that the numbers of people who had fled were no longer, it wasn't plausible to deny them anymore, and perhaps even further, that it was no longer plausible to deny that there had been large-scale violence against the Rohingya, and yet there was still this sense of denial in that there was no recognition of the implication that the government should be responding to this crisis in a swift and major way. So that's a way of thinking about literal, interpretive, and implicatory denial in a general sense. And now I want to turn more specifically to the legal aspects, as I said. So how is it that states use law in this process of denial? And I'll come to these three case studies now. So the creation of Rakhine State, or at the constitutional level. At the legislative level, the issue of voting rights. And then in the courtroom, the prosecution of journalists who had attempted to investigate violations of human rights during the conflict. So Burma, as it was then known, became independent in 1948. Even at that time, there was a lot of discussion and debate around boundaries and borders of certain states and regions, different claims about which states and regions would be recognised and which wouldn't. And in the 1950s, there were a number of different discussions taking place about the creation of new states. This included the possibility of Rakhine State. So as I mentioned, in the 1947 Constitution, Rakhine State isn't actually recognised in the way that some others were. And so there was this effort, particularly by Arakanese politicians, so these were Arakanese Buddhist politicians, who wanted to create a separate and recognised Rakhine State. These efforts led to a number of proposals being put forward in the parliament at the time in an attempt to amend the constitution and to create this idea of Arakan or Rakhine State. And I should just note there, those terms are effectively used interchangeably. And here's just an example of what the different regions looked like in 1935. So this is sort of just a step prior to independence, and you can see that actually, while there's a reference to the Arakan Hill tracts, there's not that Rakhine State as we know it today. This is just a brief, I'll skip to this one. So in contrast to those demands for a Rakhine State by Arakan Buddhists, there were others, who would identify today as Rohingya, but sometimes at the time were referred to as Arakan Muslims. And they wanted separate recognition, particularly for the area closest to the border with Bangladesh, or East Pakistan as it was then known. So if we go back to this picture, it's sort of right up in the left-hand corner where it's grey. So these group of Arakan Muslims or Rohingya tried to express their claims to territory through constitutional demands. They sought what they referred to as a Muslim state or free Muslim state, or sometimes it was referred to as the Mayu Frontier Administration area. And these debates continued for some time in Parliament. On one side you had protests taking place by Arakan Buddhist monks who were supporting the Arakan Buddhist parliamentarians in their efforts to try and recognise Rakhine State and effectively not acknowledge the minority Rohingya community to the north. But in the end, in part, it was due to elections and political issues. There was, for a brief period, actually recognition of this area in the northernmost tip of the region that we now know as Rakhine State. So this was referred to as the Mayu Frontier District. It was effectively governed or reported directly to the central government, and was perhaps in part recognition that this particular area of Myanmar, so namely Maungdaw and Buthidaung Township, had a significantly high proportion of the population were Rohingya, and that was different to the rest of that region. This didn't last very long, and so it came to end in 1964, and then by 1974 you have pink there, the recognition of Arakan or Rakhine state. And you can see there is now no longer that Mayu frontier administration area. And of course, it was in the late 1970s that then was one of the first major waves of violence and displacement, although of course there was also issues back in the 1940s and so on. And so from 1974, effectively, the Arakan Buddhists had been successful in their claims for a Rakhine state and for the non-recognition in territorial form for the minority Rohingya group. So in that regard, law, in this sense, the constitutional reform and amendment, has been used in the act of denial, because Rakhine state is effectively acknowledging the majority group, and in some sense that silences the minority. So let's come now to the second aspect or case study, if you like, which is how lawmakers use law in that process of interpretive denial. The picture that I have here is of a former member of parliament, or two of them, in fact. They are both Rohingya, and they were members of the USDP, which is the military-backed political party at the time. But nevertheless, this, the USDP had sort of co-opted them to some extent, but there were these three Muslim Rohingya members of parliament. They were the only three in parliament, and they represented some of those townships in northern Rakhine state. Now, what happened in 2015, so they were elected in a 2010 process. By 2015, the Parliament, the courts and the Election Commission had effectively all worked together to change the rules to ensure that people who had white cards, which is effectively a sort of temporary form of identity recognition and not considered to be full citizenship, but nevertheless is a form of identity, that those people would no longer be able to run for office in the 2015 elections or to vote. And so this really was a significant concern, because it meant that this election, which many people saw as the first free and fair election in Myanmar for a long time, that they were not able to participate in that. And it was a form of excluding the Rohingya from the political community and the future of that community. And so this form of legislative denial, interpretive denial through law, had something of a complex history, winding its way through different legal institutions of the state. So first of all, there was a proposal in Parliament to limit who could vote or run for office. There was then some debate with the President's office. There was clarification sought by the Speaker of Parliament with the Constitutional Tribunal in Myanmar. But then in 2015 was when this referendum law was passed to actually allow white card holders to vote. So there was an anticipation that perhaps constitutional amendment would take place and there might need to be a referendum. But then that led to the reversal of the right to vote, and effectively through both Constitutional Tribunal advisory decision and the Union Election Commission that ordered political parties to expel white card holders, which effectively meant that the Rohingya could no longer be a member of a political party or run for political office. And again, the Constitutional Tribunal confirmed that only citizens or associate citizens had these rights to vote rather than white card holders. So that's a case study of legislative reform, and again, a way in which the state has used law to deny the Rohingya the right to participate in the political community. So the third case study I come to now is around the courts. And in the courts have been involved in acts of denial in a range of ways. And what was most acute about the conflict of 2016-2017 is that initially there was very little information coming out. It was very hard to get access. Journalists were, by and large, had extreme difficulties getting in, and it was only, sometimes local journalists were able to make access. And yet some did, and what they discovered was horrific and tragic evidence of massacres in certain villages. And they, then published this with international media, and that's when things led to trials against particular journalists who'd done this. So let me just come to, how did this happen? So in 2016, which was really the first wave of this violence and targeting of Rohingya villages and displacement, and that took place in late 2016. I happened to be in Myanmar at the time and was talking to different people there while it was happening. And one of them started talking to me about, 9/10, and I was a little bit confused at first, trying to understand what do you mean by 9/10? Are you referring to 9/11, September 11? I thought maybe there was a miscommunication. And they said, no, I'm referring to 9/10. The conflict that has broken out in Rakhine State this time, we think is our September 11. And so here, state officials in Myanmar were drawing a line and an analogy between the September 11 attacks in the US, which is obviously associated with terrorism, and what had happened in Rakhine State. So from the perception of the government in Myanmar, this is how they understood this crisis, as sort of their moment of terrorism. As a result of that, there was an advisory commission put together. This advisory commission was led by Kofi Annan, so it was very high level. It was quite controversial at the time because many people in Myanmar didn't want outsiders and foreigners involved in this commission. And yet it was Aung San Suu Kyi that pushed for Kofi Annan to be a part of it. And their report, so, it took some time for the investigation. Their report, which was focused on the 2016 violence, was then published on the 25th of August, I believe, in 2017. The reason I say that is because that was when some Rohingya groups decided to target police stations in northern Rakhine State, and that led to the retaliation by the military, but on a whole another level. So the group then that had claimed responsibility for these initial attacks, and I should say sometimes, they weren't certainly weren't well equipped or armed. Sometimes it was villages surrounding police stations, and they were only armed with, sticks and stones. And so certainly the response of the military was disproportionate to that and very much overwhelmed them. So this group, which had begun communicating via Twitter, was very quickly declared by the government to be a terrorist organisation. So here you have the executive using an existing law to target this particular group. What that meant then was that when these journalists, so to come to their case, when they were investigating what had happened in this conflict, and when they uncovered these massacres that had taken place, they were effectively then accused by the state of being in possession of state secrets. So Wallon and his colleague Joso U had somehow been contacted by a police officer in Yangon. They'd been asked to meet in a certain location, and this police officer had handed over documents to them, which were in relation to the conflict. But then in a twist, Wallon and Joso U were arrested and charged with, under the Official Secrets Act, with possessing state secrets. So in effect, it was a setup. These journalists who had been investigating the massacres and who had credible and shocking evidence of what had taken place were effectively framed and set up and then put on trial in court. And this is a photo that was part of their report, which was published with Reuters. So this report was gained a lot of traction. It fairly clearly showed that there was a horrific massacre that had taken place in a particular village, and the report had been in partnership with these two local journalists, and so that's why they'd been, just to come back to their case, taken to court. So what is the role of courts here in denial? And let me sort of come back to this broader point. We've looked first at constitutional reform and the way that can play a role in states' acts of denial about suffering and human rights. We've looked at legislative reform and the application of laws to exclude and deny people, in this case through the right to vote and excluding people from voting. And here we're talking about the role of courts in reinforcing, if you like, this interpretive denial. So during the trial, the narrative that the court reinforced was that these journalists had been in possession of state secrets, that this information was something they shouldn't have had. The journalists were then jailed, and this was despite the fact that there was a police officer who testified at the time saying, well, actually they were set up, and that police officer was then disciplined. So they were imprisoned, and despite the fact that effectively what they had been doing was their job, investigative journalism. And so we see the role that the court plays in interpretive denial, in enforcing and recognizing a particular narrative by the state about what had happened in Rakhine State, and an attempt to suppress these reports about massacres, reports that were credible and backed up by evidence, and that had been really difficult to obtain given the limitations, or effectively the journalists were not able to freely go to those areas and to access Rakhine State. So let me come now to wrap up on some of this, and I'm hoping today that there are lots of questions, because I know the issue of the Rohingya is one that has been of interest to many people in Indonesia, particularly because of the potential impact that it has on the region, and I might say something about that towards the end. So just to return to this idea of states of denial, what I've tried to do today is think about the crisis of the Rohingya in a slightly different way from perhaps how it's often talked about. That is, I'm interested in how is it that the government enacts forms of denial, and how is it that law works to exclude and to deny suffering. So I've talked particularly about this idea of both literal, interpretive and implicatory denial, and focused in particular on interpretive denial as a way of excluding the Rohingya. And Stanley Cohen himself referred in particular to the role of interpretive denial and the role that law and legal institutions might play in sort of reinforcing this act of interpretive denial. And this comes back and relates to the scholar I mentioned at the beginning, Robert Koch, who was concerned with the relationship between law and violence, and reinforces his idea that legal acts of interpretive denial have particular force, given the connection between law and violence. So I'll leave it there. Obviously, there's a lot more we could talk about, and maybe I'll just say a few things. Obviously, since I've done some of this research, there has been a military coup in Myanmar, and that is both devastating but also worrying, given the situation that the Rohingya hasn't changed. So we still have very large numbers of people living in refugee camps in Bangladesh, and no real solution or possibility that they will be repatriated back to Myanmar anytime soon, and certainly no indication that they would necessarily want to. You know, I think there is the challenge and possibility that now, given that Myanmar is under military rule, that things could get worse rather than better. So that is that there will be potentially be more displacement, whether it's to the Bangladesh border or perhaps also over to the Thai border. So I think this creates a real problem for the region. There's a reason why students and scholars in Indonesia, like yourself, should be concerned about this situation, and that it is, you know, an issue that will potentially have flow-on effects for countries like Indonesia. Certainly, if we ever saw a boat crisis again, like we did in 2015, the Andaman Sea crisis, where we saw large numbers of boats coming to Indonesia and Thailand and Malaysia. If that was to happen again, it would obviously become much more of a regional crisis. The other thing I should just mention before we come to question time is there is obviously an international dimension to this now. So at the time of the particular sort of 2016-2017 situation I was talking about, there hadn't yet been international action initiated, I don't think, but obviously since then there are international proceedings ongoing. It is, you know, I think unclear at the moment how the military will respond to that, or whether they will in any way attempt to fulfill the obligations that they have for reporting now, in terms of making sure that there are no further effective acts against the Rohingya community. And so that again is concerning and means that there is very little traction for international mechanisms like that to have a real immediate impact in the way that it needs to. So look, I look forward to questions and discussion, and shall I hand it back to the moderator to see the questions coming in?
Okay, thank you, Professor Melissa. It's very interesting. From Prof. Melissa's explanations, we know that Rohingya ethnics has many experience for denial or rejection from the government in the various for the various reasons. So this has led to human rights violations in the Rohingya ethnics. So students, this is time for raise questions to Professor Melissa. So freely ask about Myanmar, about just now Professor Melissa said about not only about law, but also its political background in the Myanmar, something that why this is ethnic Rohingya become a very suffer from the Myanmar. So any questions from the students? Silakan bertanya. Anda mau menanyakan apa? Gak apa-apa, bertanya saja ya. Nanti
Putu Sri Rati, if someone has their hand.
Okay, please raise the questions for Professor Melissa.
Okay, thank you for Professor Melissa for sharing your knowledge with us about the law in Myanmar also. And the first time when you were talking about the Rohingya and Bangladesh, I immediately tried to look in the internet the news about Rohingya and also Bangladesh, and I read that Bangladesh refused to accommodate the refugees from Rohingya. And my question is, if we see legally, does Bangladesh have an obligation to accommodate the Rohingya refugees? Thank you.
Okay, Prof. Melissa, maybe you can directly answer the questions.
Yes, thank you so much for asking a question. I'd really encourage others to feel free to do so directly. So one of the challenges in the region is obviously that the Refugee Convention hasn't been signed on by various countries. And so Bangladesh doesn't have an obligation in that regard. They have at the moment, the Rohingya refugees are still living there, but obviously the position of the Bangladesh government is that they won't allow them to stay there long term. I don't think we have an update at the moment as to repatriation plans. There were some, initial steps and agreements. This was, a number of years ago when we still had a National League for Democracy government. But since then, and particularly since the coup, the challenge is that the attention is no longer on this issue, and it's no longer has the urgency perhaps that it once had. And that's because there is conflict. There is conflict in many towns and townships across Myanmar at the moment. So the situation now is much more complicated because the issue is one of conflict between the military and the people more broadly, rather than simply a much narrower conflict between the Rohingya and the military, or simply the military against the Rohingya. There's also, other parts of the country where there is now significant fighting include Chin State, where there is some, very concerning actions being taken by the military, as well as in other parts of the country. So I think that the challenge, now is that there is really no realistic prospect of repatriation anytime soon. And so it is likely to be a much more protracted time in Bangladesh. Did you have a follow-up question?
No, I think that's enough. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Putu Srirati, for the questions. And maybe there's another question from the participants, students. This is very interesting discussions because many students raise this issue in their thesis. So about Myanmar, how the fulfillment of the fundamental rights, because Rohingya, someone said that this is stateless person or something, like because there is a denial from the government, Myanmar, and also from Bangladesh. So they don't have any right to citizenship. So this is very more difficult to Rohingya ethnics to get the fundamental rights, so to get the fulfillment of the fundamental rights. Okay, there is one question from the chat box. I will read for you, Prof. Melissa. Thank you. Before to Professor Melissa, I have questions. What are the implications of the Rohingya human crisis on politics and the security of the ASEAN countries? Thank you.
Thank you. This is quite a broad question, but I think you're right that it will remain for some time a point of instability or potential instability in the region. I think that the longer the crisis plays out, the more protracted it is, the more likely it is that people may try to move on from Bangladesh if they, for example, have relatives in Malaysia or elsewhere, if the situation and opportunities and condition in Bangladesh is dire, then it's inevitable that people may try to move on from there, and that could either lead to further movement, whether it's by land, but particularly by sea. So I think the question is, you know, how will ASEAN respond? You know, the response of ASEAN this year to the military coup in particular has been extremely disappointing and frustrating for pro-democracy activists in the region. Many of those who are, you know, currently opposing the military regime were desperately hoping that there would be much more swifter action and stronger action from both ASEAN, but particularly from the international community. We really haven't seen that. While there has been some more individual statements from different countries, you know, at the collective level, you know, it hasn't gone far enough. And so I think there's a challenge that the Rohingya crisis is now, you know, unfortunately just one of the many issues facing Myanmar. So for example, I think even today we heard that there are quite a number of areas in Myanmar now where the internet has been turned off. So the military is using the strategy of turning off the internet as a way of restricting people's ability to oppose them effectively. And that's extremely concerning and also very worrying for those who are simply trying to obtain up-to-date information on what's going on, you know, checking in on family and friends that they know in that region. And so it gives you some sense of just the very real complications at the moment. And as I said, given the fact that there is fighting in many places, there are people being displaced in a number of regions and states, that the displacement and refugee crisis is now no longer just the Rohingya, but also affects many other groups. And I should, I guess, qualify that by saying, obviously, there was still fighting in other parts of the country prior to the coup, but certainly not on the scale that we're seeing now. And I think, unfortunately, it's only likely to escalate in coming months and possibly years rather than reduce. But I see we have another hand. So, Eleonora.
Yeah, we have Eleonora. Eleonora, time is yours to ask the question.
Okay, thank you. So, as is mentioned before, that in ASEAN, well, how governments use law as a way back to deny suffering. This brings us back to broader issues of human rights. What do you think about how do governments cope with that issues? Because we have a lot of similar issues and crises. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. It cut out a little bit there at the end. So if please let me know if my answer doesn't quite respond to what you asked. I think from what I understand, you were asking about the nature of human rights in the region and human rights protection, how this relates to the issue of the Rohingya. Look, that's obviously a big question. I think the reality is that across the region prior to COVID, we were seeing a decline in democracy and a rise of illiberalism. And so illiberalism, you know, in many ways, by its nature, leads to compromises of human rights. I think during COVID, there has been a further trend in that, or acceleration, if you like, in that decline of democracy. This has happened in a range of ways, or has been certainly been questioned and debated in a range of ways. In some countries, you know, we've seen parliament suspended, like in Malaysia. In some countries, elections have been postponed, although some have then held them later on. Obviously, there are lots of various human rights issues in the COVID crisis, you know, such as how various lockdown or curfew regulations are enforced and regulated, who gets, you know, prosecuted for breaches of these regulations, and whether there's discrimination in that process. So, for example, actually in Myanmar, I think, one of the first cases of COVID was actually of a Rohingya man who had flown in from overseas. And unfortunately, that meant that there were very sort of racist and discriminatory overtones in how people in Myanmar initially viewed COVID-19. So they associated it with the Rohingya, and that led to further discrimination on that basis. There are many other issues we can talk about, and I'm also interested to hear from you in your course, because I understand you're studying international relations, how else you've been studying human rights in the region and the Rohingya crisis in particular. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any comment, Eleanor? Wow.
No, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. We still have, okay, there is one more question from the chat box. I will wait for you. Hello, Miss Melissa. I'm Arliza from class 1A. I want to ask a question. I think Myanmar isn't here any protest from international forum and another country. How about? Isn't wrong, ma'am? Is it right? Okay.
So yeah, I think my understanding is maybe you're referring to the coup and whether there has been an international response to that. So where that is currently at, so maybe I should just briefly explain something about the coup. So on the 1st of February, the military took over. At that time, there was supposed to be a incoming elected government. So there had been elections in November 2020. The NLD, the National League for Democracy, had won successfully that election, although it had been contested and there had been discussion and debate about whether elections should have been held in areas where elections had been postponed due to conflict and other reasons. And since the elections, the military had questioned whether the election, whether there was electoral fraud, whether the voter list was correct. And so the military took the opportunity on the 1st of February to arrest and detain a number of high-level elite politicians, particularly from the National League for Democracy and including Aung San Suu Kyi. There was, of course, condemnation of that action, which is widely considered to be unconstitutional and a coup, illegal. But there has the calls from pro-democracy activists for greater intervention by the international community haven't materialized. Where the situation is currently at is there is a UN Credentials Committee, which is the body that decides which representative from a country should represent that country at the UN in the case of a dispute. So at the moment, there is basically a dispute between who should represent Myanmar at the UN. On one hand, there is the ambassador who defected, and so he is claiming to represent the opposition government, which is known as the National Unity Government. So this is a body that consists of members who were elected in the 2020 elections, as well as others who are supporting and driving this pro-democracy movement. So they are claiming the right to represent Myanmar at the UN. But of course, also there is a representative from the military. And so the military is trying to claim the right in the international stage to represent the people. So that process is ongoing, and it could take some time for the UN Credentials Committee to decide. They may end up deferring the decision further. And so it could be quite some time until we know whether the international community is willing to recognize and acknowledge the pro-democracy representative, so the representative from the National Unity Government. And so that recognition at the international level, that would obviously be a significant step. That would then signal to governments around the world that they should be in bilateral conversations with this national unity government and supporting its efforts to end military rule and to return to civilian rule, and particularly to democratic rule. But at this stage, it's uncertain which way it will go, and that's only one aspect of the challenges that lie ahead. And it certainly doesn't in any way affect the demands and I guess the credibility of the pro-democracy movement and the strength of that, which is driven a lot by students, young people like yourselves who don't want to return to military rule. They've seen and had experienced almost 10 years of relative but growing freedoms in many respects. They've experienced the opportunity to get an education and had opportunities to engage with the global community quite often, and now those opportunities have gone, and the prospect of returning to military rule for the long term is obviously a very scary thing for many people, particularly given the horrific nature of and the previous ways in which the military regime ruled Myanmar. So I'll stop there, but that was a great question.
Okay, thank you, Professor Melissa. So maybe there's one more question. One more questions before we close the discussions for today, because maybe we will have another more time discussions, Professor. So maybe there is one last more questions, or this is enough for today. Okay, thank you, Professor Melissa. As we know that Myanmar crisis is only one of the example of several problems in ASEAN, and this must be our common concern, especially in ASEAN countries, to reduce human rights violations in the ASEAN region, because we have an international responsibility to protect human rights. So I think that's all of the 3-in-1 program for today. I said thank you very much once again for Professor Melissa to joining our program, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.